Well, thank you guys all for being here. We are excited to continue this series on the life of David. Seth has done a really good job. A lot of times when we read these Bible stories, we read them like that, like a story. And if you read a good book, most authors, what they do is they pick like 3 or 4 like good character traits, and then like 2 bad character traits. And the person in that story can't help but be within those very small realms of life. And Seth has done a really good job of making us realize that David was a full and complete person. That the stories in the Bible aren't stories, but they're history. And the history of real people with real lives that did real things and reacted, sometimes good and sometimes bad. And David is no exception. I think of most Bible characters that we have a misunderstanding of who David is, that we remember him from David and Goliath from Sunday school, and it's weighed our view of him in ways that not inappropriate, but aren't necessarily true for the full depth of his character. Jane, you're here. You said you weren't going to be here. Oh, I'm so excited. Oh, what a good day. So where Seth left off, and if you haven't been here yet or you missed some of the messages, I do encourage you to check out the YouTube channel because it's really good. This has been a great series. But where he left off, David had just spared Saul's life, right? Saul came into the cave to use the little king's room, and David did not harm him. And if you think about it, with this story and 2 of the 3 stories I'm going to talk about today, it's kind of David given the same basic temptation. Are you going to trust the providential hand of God, or are you going to take matters into your own hand? And as you watch David, there's 2 things that he's got down packed, 2 things for sure that he knows. Number 1, don't kill Saul. He's got that one. Number 2, go and kill Philistines. He's got that one. And maybe number 3 is cut people's heads off. He's good at that as well. He seems to enjoy it. But everything else is kind of in a gray area for David. So David's fled into the wilderness, and while David is in the wilderness, we see that he faces these 3 temptations to do things on his own terms, which sounds kind of familiar for some of us. It sounds a lot like Jesus, doesn't it? Right? Jesus went into the wilderness and got tempted by Satan. And in fact, the pattern of the temptations is actually very similar in a sense, since Satan tempts Jesus to have the kingdom on his own terms. And Jesus responds that first time with the word of the Lord. And we saw David do that last week when he was going to kill Saul. He says, "No, but would I touch the Lord's anointed?" That's the word of the Lord. So he responds with truth, and it keeps him from committing a huge error. So we've seen one of these wilderness temptations, and we're going to see number 2 in this story with Nabal right here. So if you have a Bible, please go and pull it out. We're in 1 Samuel 25, and we're starting in verse 1. Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now notice, we get this huge description of this man. Right? We hear all about him and who he is, but we don't even find out what his name is yet. Why is it? It's because Nabal lives his life this way. It's all about his stuff more than anything else, which led one commentary to say, Nabal is the perfect picture of someone who has experienced every blessing of the protection of God and was miserable as a consequence. Verse 3, now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife was Abigail. The name Nabal actually means fool. Right? The guy's name means fool. Now, I had some nicknames in high school. That's not one I would enjoy. But Nabal wore it. He owned it. So we get this picture of Nabal as a rich fool. Right? Jesus talked about rich fools, and he talked to a rich fool in the New Testament. It was never good. Now, the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. So we see this contrast between Abigail and Nabal, husband and wife. She's discerning and beautiful. He's harsh and badly behaved. What would it be like for this woman to be married to this man who's harsh and badly behaved? Jessica can tell you all about it later, I'm sure. But it's probably pretty terrible, right? What's interesting is This is one of those stories that we hear about, at least in Sunday school, it seems, and it's like this epic romance, right? She's married to this beast, and David rides in on his white horse and saves her from him, and then they ride off into the sunset on the back of her donkey, and it is this romance. But I don't think that's actually how we want to evaluate this story. First off, how does a woman like Abigail end up married to a guy like Nabal? Right? If she's so wise, why would she want to marry this man? Odds are she had no choice, right? It's probably an arranged marriage. So let's put that out there as well. She's married to this harsh and mean guy, and she had no choice. Imagine the life that Abigail's living. And in a minute, she's about to find out that Nabal's life is going to be threatened, that she can just stand back and let it happen. And if I'm Abigail, I'm like, great, this is my ticket out of here, right? I can be free of this guy, this monster. But that's not what she does. She's actually even wiser than that. So Abigail is discerning and beautiful. Nabal's harsh and badly behaved. He's also a Calebite. Now that word is thrown in there just for this extra measure of how disgusting the situation of Nabal is. Right? Caleb from the Old Testament, he's one of the good guys. Caleb and Joshua are two of Moses' right-hand men, and Nabal is a descendant of one of these faithful biblical heroes. And he's fallen so far from what he could have been. All right, verse 4. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, go up to Carmel, and go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him, peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. How many times does he say peace? In just a minute, he's about to say the word sword. How many times do you think he's going to say the word sword? Yeah. We're going to go in a very short period of time from peace, peace, peace to sword, sword, sword. I don't know, David. So anyway, peace, peace, peace. Number 7, I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did no harm. And they missed nothing all the time they're in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David. He's employing the submissive language, right? Your son David, he's being very humble. Right, he's asking for, honestly, what ends up being a very small favor in comparison to what we're going to find out, this large display of goodwill that David had just done for him. David has 600 men, right? He's trying to feed them out in the wilderness, and he's asking a fairly fair request. But the person he's asking it of is not a fair man by any stretch of the imagination. When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servant, who's David? Who's the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where? So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to his men, let's go in peace. This man is a fool. No, that would have been nice. That's not what he did. What he says is every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on their sword, and David also strapped on his sword. Remember, this is sword of Goliath, right? He went and got it from the priest last week, so it's a very big, awesome sword. About 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. So Nabal has demonstrated kind of how surly he is and kind of gross he is. He's deeply ungrateful for what David's done. He knows who David is. In fact, the reason that he has the sheep that that he's having a successful time of shearing that he's having, is because David's men had protected his flocks. He'd taken care of the shepherds for him by his 600 men, right? So he would not be enjoying this bounty that he's having right now if it weren't for David and his men. This is a reasonable request from David, and when he gets turned down, does David respond very reasonably? No, right? He's going to put everybody to death. They're strapping on their swords. Peace, 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 sword, sword, sword. And I have to wonder, as Abigail goes through what she's about to do, if some of the motivation behind her actions is not for the people, right? If maybe she wants to protect some of these people that she sees David going to attack. We don't know if she had sons and daughters by Nabal, right? It doesn't say so in the story, but I wonder what the implications are for her. Plus, for David, this is just vengeance, right? So we see David here tempted again to take matters into his own hands and act as judge and jury. His punishment he's about to seek exceeds the crime. So David's about to seek judgment, but something else too, it's foolishness on his part. So Abigail is now a woman caught between two fools. David is preparing to use his sword against fellow Israelites. Right? These are not Philistines that he's going to mow down. At this point, he wants to put to death his own men because of the offense of one foolish man. One act of foolishness answered by another act of foolishness. You guys ever been there? Right? You ever make a poor choice in response to somebody else's poor choice? Parents, you ever yell at your kids because they just did something really dumb? Right? You ever lose your temper because of something irrational? So Abigail, verse 14, but one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm. We did not miss anything when we were in the fields, as long as we went with them. They were a wall to us both by day and by night. All the while we're with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this and consider what you should do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his house. And he's such a worthless man. This guy has Nabal's number, right? That no one can speak to him. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 seahs of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on donkeys. She said to her young men, go on before me. Behold, I come after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. Why not? He's a harsh and violent man, right? And as she rode on the donkey and came under cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Here's Abigail. She's risking her own life and well-being to go intercede on behalf of a foolish man in his household. Right? Not only that, but she brings this feast for him. She prepares a table in the presence of her husband's enemies. We see Abigail going to intercede. She's willing to lay down her life for the sake of somebody whose life doesn't even seem to be worth saving. Sound familiar? Now, David had said, surely in vain have I guarded all this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and who's returned me evil for good. God so do to the enemies of David more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. David's scary. David's harsh. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face, bowing to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. Now then, let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. I suspect this is not the first time that Abigail has had to intercede on the behalf of Nabal. She was too good at it, right? But in this case, she goes to David and she displays that she has some knowledge of who he is, that the Lord's purpose is big for him, and she speaks very generously to him. Right? She's carrying the whole guilt of the situation because she hopes to spare her house from destruction. And she encourages him along the lines that he should be thinking about that time that he was in the cave with Saul, when he spared Saul's life, and this process that he's already worked through. And it makes you kind of wonder, why is David's reaction so crazy here? Right? He already knows what the right answer is, but he does something absolutely crazy. And I wonder if it's probably because of the frustration he has, and the fear and the sorrow that he's felt in this cave. As he's been living on the lam, as he's been fearing for his life, his time out in the wilderness. Right? Have you ever had this happen to you where you suffer an offense? And the next time someone offends you, maybe it's even a lesser offense than the one served to you, you just kind of fly off the handle. Right? And I think that's what we're seeing here. Like husbands, like you ever have a bad day at work? and you come home and you take it out on your spouse? Right? Moms, your husband ever have a bad day at work and he takes it out on you and then you take it out on your kids? Right, kids, your dad ever have a bad day at work and he takes it out on your mom and your mom takes it out on you and you bite the head off your Barbie doll? Right. Been a lot better if the dad just bit the head off the Barbie doll in the first place. Right. But we're all like this, right? When we find someone we have some measure of control over, when we feel like we lack control in other areas of our life, when they come out against us, we tend to overreact. It's a pretty common scenario. But we need David to be better than this, don't we? Right? He's a man after God's own heart. And we need him to be better than this. So she gives him this gift, and in verse 28, she says, "Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house. Because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall be found in you so long as you live." Shall not be found in you. Is that true or false, though? Is there no evil in David as long as he lives? No, unfortunately. In fact, right now, he's about to go kill a bunch of people needlessly, right? But she's speaking kind of aspirationally. She's calling him to something better than he's currently walking towards. Because here's the deal with Abigail. She recognizes a fool, right? She knows who David is, and she knows what he's about to do is foolish. Right? She's got a great fool detector, and it's beeping wildly. Verse 29, "If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God." What a cool image. Or picture like a bundle of sticks all tied up and ready to go, brought to a campfire, and David's a stick in the middle where nobody can get to him, right? "And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of his sling." You know the right imagery for David, right? David and Goliath, the sling. Verse 30, "And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he's spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant." So he asks to remember it. So what do we find out about Abigail? She knows that David is the rightful king. She knows it's a matter of time before he comes into that position. And she desires for him to be able to go into that with a clear conscience. Now, is she in love with him? Is this a grand romance like we're led to believe? I don't think we pull that from the story. We see an act of self-preservation, an act of generosity towards David, absolutely. But what is Abigail doing? She's managing folly on both sides. And she knows in order for her to have a chance of any survival, and for those that she cares about, she must align herself with the man of God's choosing, no matter what the outcome is. Verse 32, "And David said to Abigail, 'Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male.' And David received from her hand what she had brought him, and he said to her, 'Go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition.'" So peace, 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 sword, 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 go in peace. Phew, we got the right ending there. Because one of the ways that God speaks to us is through the wisdom of other people, right? And David listened here. We have the same opportunity day in and day out of David and Nabal here. But sometimes we decide to act like Nabal and harden our hearts instead of listening to the wisdom like David did. So Abigail solved this one, right? Everything's better except one thing. Abigail has to go home now, right? Verse 36, "And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king." Now here's the problem. Abigail understands who David is, and we know Nabal more than likely knew who David was, even though he pretended like he didn't. But Nabal here is playing the king, right? He's not going to serve David. He says, "I'm the king in my house." And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. You know what's worse than a harsh man? A drunk harsh man. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. Why is she terrified? Right? This woman who faced down David and 400 soldiers on the back of a donkey is scared to talk to Nabal while he's drunk. This says a lot about Nabal. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things. Now I'm going to be a nerd for a second here. In the morning, Nabal had to go to the bathroom, right? That's what this means. We're just going to put it out there. But what's happening here, it says, is he's emptying himself of wine. But there's a joke here that we don't necessarily get because most of us don't speak Hebrew. But the word Nebel with ease means wineskin, right? Which is playing on the name Nabal. And the idea is Nabal, meaning wineskin. He's presenting here as a wineskin being emptied of wine, right? Ancient Hebrews, this is hilarious. So she waits, right? In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, insert laughter here, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. Now, we don't actually know what happened here. Like he slipped into a coma or something, or he froze, and I can't believe you-ness. But he's immobilized by this news. And then about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. So we have David strapping on swords, running around yelling about this great plan, sword, 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 I'll cut off his head, I like doing that. And then what does it take the Lord to get rid of Nabal? About half a sentence, right? It took about half a sentence, but at the right time in the right place. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head." See, David is obsessed with people's heads. I don't know what it's about. But so what do we see is the contrast between David, who acts foolishly, and Nabal, who acts foolishly. So we have Abigail, she's the picture of wisdom in this story. Right? And we can see in the response of David and Nabal the way people typically respond to wisdom. What does Nabal do? Is he repentant? No, he persists in his harshness and his sin until literally the bitter end. But what about David? He listens. He's willing to be persuaded by somebody else's wisdom. What it means to be a man after God's own heart here. So, man after God's own heart means when confronted with your sin, you repent. Not that you're an epic hero, that we're all to bow down and worship how great you are. Let's see what happens next. Verse 39. Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, "David has sent us to take you to him as his wife." She rose and bowed her face to the ground and said, "Behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of your servants, my lord." And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. It's making you guys nervous a little bit. He wants to take her as his wife. His men said he's going to take you as his wife. Then look at verse 43. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Take. This is exactly what Samuel had warned back in chapter 8 about. Right? I'll give you a king, but he will take. Deuteronomy 17:17, one of the rules set up by God for the kings is he must not take many wives or his heart will be led astray. It took David approximately 13 seconds to go from a good choice to a bad one, right? Which brings us to chapter 26. We made it. 25, good job. So we've had the wilderness temptation number 2, right? And now we're going to have wilderness temptation number 3 if we're following the example of Jesus here. And if you did your devotional this week, we had a lengthy opportunity to go back and map the parallels between David sparing Saul's life last time and him sparing Saul's life this time. And if you skipped the devotional, the Lord sees. All right, in chapter 26, we see the Ziphites tip off Saul again to David's location. Then we see Saul in a place of vulnerability. This time he's asleep in camp. We see David's men urge him to strike as they did in the previous story. Then we see David acquire a symbolic object. There are actually 2 in this one, a spear and a water jug, while Saul was sleeping. We see David refuse once again to harm Saul. calling on him the Lord's anointed. We see another reference to the will of God, this being not the will of God, which is a similar parallel to what we see Jesus do when he speaks back to Satan in the wilderness in his 3 temptations. But this is the second way that God speaks to us. God speaks to us through his word. Right? David knows the word of the Lord when he refuses to harm Saul. Remember the thing David is good at, right? He remembers, don't kill Saul, kill Philistines, cut off people's heads. So he refuses to harm Saul, and then we see him plead his case just as he had done in the earlier chapters. And then we see Saul ask, is that your voice, my son David? Right? Saul's literally reading the same script as the first time. And then we see Saul the penitent, at least in his speech. And then we hear David respond, and we hear Saul speak a blessing over David. And then the final statements match, and David and Saul part ways. Right? There's a sum up. Why would we have 2 almost identical stories in this text? Right? Why include them both other than that they happened historically? But why tell them in such a similar way? What does the author want to establish? Well, I think he's trying to establish David's innocence and Saul's guilt. Right? Because it's one thing for Saul to be sorry the first time. Like we can believe that. We can read that and be like, oh, that, he's repentant. Oh, I cried a little bit. Good job, Saul. It's a nice speech, right? You brought me to tears. It seemed heartfelt. But when we see it repeated again, it's establishing a pattern. Saul's not going to change. He is who he is. And then notice how David talks about the sovereignty of God in verse 10. And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he'll go down into battle and perish. David acknowledges there's any number of ways for Saul to meet his end, and it does not have to be at David's hand. And he's content with letting that course run itself out. It doesn't have to be David who does it. And the reason why is he just saw this happen with Nabal, right? David's learning. It's like, I didn't have to do anything. The Lord will do it in the right place in the right time. Because God speaks to us in his own time. And there's peace that comes with waiting for the Lord instead of creating an action or forcing a situation because you want it or because it would make life easier. So David's learning. We see David learning. We see Saul becoming more and more calcified in his patterns. So why does David take the spear? Well, when we look back at all the times Saul was with the spear, he was pretty much always chucking it at David, or he was holding it as a sign of authority. Right? So David's saying, you tried to kill me with this thing, right? I could have cut your head off with it, but I chose not to. I'm getting very good at cutting people's heads off. And this is a sign of your authority, and I've removed it from you. Right? It's a very powerful symbolism for David. The 2 parallel stories also reinforce for us that Saul is not going to change and that David is growing. He's growing in his understanding of what it means to be a person who acts wisely, who doesn't step rashly, who can listen to wise counsel from others, who finds peace on the word of the Lord, who understands you can trust vengeance to the Lord, who understands you can trust his own life to the Lord. But then we get to chapter 27 and David forgets all that. So David's been running for a long time. And it has to be exhausting. Living in caves, trying to take care of these 600 men with no resources. And I think when we read the opening verses of chapter 27, we're willing to give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. But we really still want him to be a better man. We really want him to trust in all the things the Lord has already done and all the things the Lord has promised that he will do in the future. But then David said in his heart, now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. We're starting to see this utter discouragement begin to set in for David. One time I told my buddy, I think that David might battle with depression. And he told me with my amateur psychology that I'm not allowed to diagnose David with depression. But he does seem like he's pretty upset. But he's tired of this cycle of running away, of never knowing what's going to happen, having death looming over his head. And he starts to doubt the promises of God. He says, there's nothing better for me than that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the border of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand. So David arose and went over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, and David with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, Nabal's widow. And it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. Then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given in one of the country towns that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? So David's establishing a comfortable distance between himself and Achish here. If you remember him from previous stories, this is where David had gone to him fleeing before, and then Achish seemed like he was going to hurt David because like, isn't this the guy that's killing all of us? And then David pretended like he was mad and like drooled all over himself and stuff. And Achish's like, okay, never mind. This is just a crazy person. Right? David thinks Achish is just a big dummy, right? He can just pull the wool over his eyes. Which kind of reminds me of a story back in Genesis, where we see David in a time of discouragement fleeing into the territory of his enemies, or are they? He's kind of in a gray area right now. But he gets there, and what does he do? He practiced deception on his enemies. But he's going there to find security at the same time. It's kind of like Abraham, right? When Abraham goes down to Egypt and they're pulling one over on Pharaoh, whether Sarah's his sister or his wife. And that was a very clear illustration of an act of self-reliance. And I think that's a pattern we want to see here. David's faltering in his ability to trust the Lord. Right? And so he goes to the Philistines. And then notice that there's no commentary in chapter 27, number one, on if what he's doing is right or wrong. Right? We don't know. In fact, you may notice that in 27, there's no mention of the Lord either. Right? God drops out of the text. And when that happens, it's pretty significant. It's a good chance of saying, okay, hold on, what's going on here? Because that's what we also see in Genesis. When God completely drops out of this section, it's bad news. And we're left to our own thoughts. What's he doing? Is it right or is it wrong? And I think it's probably a little early at this point to tell, but it feels like it's kind of a little bit of both. But by walking to Philistine territory, he's on the one hand doing the only thing he thinks he can, but on the other hand, it should be a disturbing sign to us. That said, sometimes God speaks to us through hard and confusing times. Right? Sometimes our own desire to shut him out speaks louder than anything else. But what purpose? Why would God use Abigail to speak to David? Why would God use his word to speak to David? And why would he allow David to wade into confusion? Well, it's all for one purpose. In order to recenter David's focus on God, where it should have been all along. I want to end with a quick story. In 1989, there was this earthquake that almost flattened Armenia. Right? This deadly tremor killed over 30,000 people in less than 4 minutes. Right? In midst of all the confusion of this earthquake, a father rushed to his son's school. And when he arrived there, the building had been as flat as a pancake. And he was standing there looking at what was left of this school. And he remembered a promise he made to his son. He said, no matter what, I will be there for you. And tears began to fill his eyes. It looked like this hopeless situation, but he couldn't take his mind off the promise he made. So he remembered where his son's classroom was in the back right corner of the building. So he rushed there and started digging through the rubble. And he's digging, and other grieved parents arrive, and they're clutching their hearts, and they're weeping for their sons and their daughters. And they try to pull him off what was left of the school, and they say, it's too late, they're dead. Right? You can't help, go home. The police come, and the firemen come, and they said, there's nothing here, there's no reason to dig, just go home. Everyone tried to stop him. And every time somebody approached him to stop him, he said, are you going to help me or not? They didn't answer, and he continued to dig for his son, stone by stone. He needed to know for himself, is my boy dead or alive? So he dug for 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours. At the 38th hour, he pulls back a boulder. He hears his son's voice. He screamed his son's name, Armand. And a voice answered him, Dad? It's me, Dad, I'm here. And then the boy added these priceless words. I told the other kids not to worry. I told them if you were alive that you would save me. And when you saved me, you would save them because you made a promise, Dad. You said, no matter what, you said, I will always be there for you. And here you are, Dad, you kept your promise. Our Father is calling out to us. Our Father does speak to us. And he's made a promise to always be there for us. The question is, are we listening? Are we waiting? Do we hear his word? Let's pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for this chance to come and be in your presence. Thank you for the opportunity to hear your word on a Sunday, Lord, for the life of David and the example that he set, both the good and the bad, Lord, that we can learn through him. Lord, we thank you that you're willing to speak to us, that you're not a God that just created things, set them in motion and left, but you have a genuine interest in our lives. Lord, I pray that we will seek wisdom from other people, Lord, that we'll engage in your word through the Bible, and that we'll be willing to, when we're in hard or confusing times, look for you, Lord. Lord, we pray that this week that is something that we live by. In Jesus' name, amen.